Chapter 4. At last Sunday arrived and, at 10 in the morning, Mary was ready to be collected by Charles to go to prepare the lunch at his house. Forgetting all moderation, she had applied a great deal of makeup to her face and body. In 10 minutes, her father would have finished chanting the high mass, and 20 minutes later Charles' car would arrive. She looked forward to the latter. Already, she had heard and ignored the gossip of parish residents who talked of her suspect relationship with the young psychiatrist, and she had seen how those who had not dared to talk had craned their necks like giraffes just to make sure it had been her they had seen. But she had thrown caution to the wind and armed herself with the words from the New Testament that she had heard her father use so often, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." She heard footsteps on the wooden staircase and knew her parents had returned from church. She resumed the combing of her glossy hair for 5 more minutes, then studied herself in the mirror and, pleased at what she saw there, she smiled. The clock chimed 2 p.m. The doorbell rang twice. Charles took 2 quick steps to the front door and opened it. The aroma of sweet nut tobacco assailed his nostrils and he sniffed at it appreciatively, savoring the tongue. The visitor gave him a warm smile and handed him a businessman's leather briefcase. "Hello, Professor Eastman. I'm so glad you could come." "Hello Charles, my boy, how are you?" "Fine, sir." "Come in, please." The professor stepped in and followed Charles into the sitting room. To their surprise, Mary, whose back was turned to them, was swerving her hips to Harry Belafonte's island in the sun. The professor winked at Charles and they watched as, oblivious of their presence, she continued gyrating with athletic ease and stunning grace. "Mary," Charles finally called to her, "come and meet Professor Eastman." At the mention of her name, Mary spun around and seeing them buried her face in her hands with embarrassment, but soon recollected herself and walked over to greet the professor. As arranged, Charles busied himself in his study on the pretext of looking for a book for the professor. The conversation, which was so tailored by the professor as to avoid the subject of Mary's attacks, turned towards Mary herself and she talked about her childhood and life in general up to the present day. Mary felt quite at ease. She had spoken at various school gatherings and debates and the professor was very easy to talk to, so she soon overcame any initial shyness. She questioned him about his own school days and his family. Her English was good, and she had the ability to lead the conversation from one topic to another quite naturally. 10 minutes later, Charles rejoined them and invited them to the table to eat. He sat at the head of the table whilst Mary faced the professor, an arrangement which would give him a good view of the anticipated events. Soon the only sound came from the cutlery. 8 minutes had passed, and 2 more minutes of suspense were what each quietly expected. Mary appeared to be totally relaxed as she ate her shrimps. Suddenly she raised her eyes to the professor's and sweetly inquired if he was enjoying the food. "It is marvelous, Mary," he replied. It was 2:19 p.m. "My father loves shrimps too," Mary said, trying to continue the conversation. "My Sunday dishes usually consist of fish, Mary," Charles said lightly, trying to sound at ease. "For breakfast I have 3 huge crabs with pepper, onion, HP sauce and baka. That is always food enough to last until 1:30, and then I follow it with polo nut soup or groundnut soup and very small shellfish, locally called bibiu, and kita schoolboys, with fufu." "Really Charles, you will make me choke on my food," Mary said, coughing and laughing. "Sorry Mary, but it's true. They are also called choka cowboys or rascals. They are very tiny and are very difficult to catch, that is why they are called schoolboys, rascals and so on, because of their artful dodger capabilities." Professor Eastman could not help choking on the food with laughter. "All right, since I am causing discomfort instead of mirth, I cease fire." Charles smiled. The nervous silence engulfed them all again. At last, it was 2:20 p.m. but Mary's awaited ordeal never came. The professor was bemused but managed not to show it. Charles sat tight, torn between relief for Mary that it had not happened and the thought that the professor must be examining him and his motives very carefully with his psychiatrist's mind. He felt a mixture of worry, pain, anxiety, and disappointment. He was truly hopeful that the attack had cured itself, just as it had come by itself, and yet he had wanted it to take place to prove the truth of all he had told the professor. Mary, the professor smiled as he addressed her, trying to relieve the tension. Who was the cook? I was, Professor, she replied gratefully. Will you award me a degree in that profession? The professor could not help laughing. No degrees yet, Mary, but it tasted like my grandma's cooking, and that's the highest praise you could get from me. Thanks, but I think we'd better finish the meal before you make a final decision. When they had finished eating, they went back to the lounge where they played a game of Aware until 4 o'clock when Professor Eastman had to leave. None of them referred to what had not taken place. Soon after the professor had left, the telephone rang. Charles answered it. 66096, Charles Sego speaking. It is Mrs. Quarcoopome here. How are things going? You'll be pleased to hear that the afternoon passed without incident. Thank God. Mary, Charles called to her, come and speak to your mother. She took the receiver from him. Yes, Ma, she responded to a question from her mother. Yes, I will trust in the Lord whose daughter I am. It seemed that Mary repeated these words after her mother with little real feeling. Suddenly a cold, hissing wind blew through the window and a golden goblet which had been on the broad wooden curtain holder fell, crashing to the floor. Mary clutched at the receiver with both hands. Then suddenly she dropped onto the sofa nearby and sat tensely, staring unblinkingly into space. She sat morbid, almost like a corpse. Charles picked up a pen and notebook from the side table and focused all his attention on Mary. She moved swiftly, with the ease and grace of an antelope, to the dining chair where she had sat earlier. She gripped the back of it and kept her unwavering gaze upon it. The chair began to shake violently. Charles scribbled briefly in his notebook. Then she began to chant. He jotted the words down. It was an unintelligible chant which she followed with a weird, methodical stepping, some kind of crazy dance that Charles could not describe, in harmony with the chant. It was then that her cheeks began to puff out, her eyes became a ghastly blood red and looked about to pop out of their sockets. Mary began to move very stealthily towards Charles. Mary looked vicious and Charles moved away. He could see that her intentions were malicious towards himself. The change his own sweet Mary had undergone in such a short time stunned his senses and he was not ready to defend himself when she finally attacked. Grabbing at a bottle of Fanta on the table, Mary leveled it, with all her newly found strength, at Charles' head. He fell to the floor, bleeding from a deep cut above his left ear, but was soon up and moving as quickly as possible out of her reach. He realized now that he was in real danger from her since it appeared she had turned the full force of her superhuman strength against him. He dashed, clutching his wounded head to staunch the bleeding, to the bathroom for cover. Locking the door, he placed the metal latch in position for double security, and then sank down onto the floor. Meanwhile, Mary appeared to forget Charles. She began to tear at her dress, then she collapsed onto the sofa with a fish knife in one hand, blood dripping from her left shoulder and a yellow substance oozing from the left corner of her lipsticked mouth. On the far side of the room, the telephone receiver dangled, swinging to and fro with the precision of a clock pendulum. Zandria rushed into Ishmael's study. He was poring over a text from the Bible which was to form the basis of his sermon that evening. He never tired of the Bible and miraculously always found some new philosophical meaning or explanation for old and well-known statements from it. He hardly reacted to his wife's entrance, so immersed was he in his work, but the intruder ignored his inattentiveness and spoke with real urgency in her dry voice. I have a feeling Mary is going through her attack again. I was just talking to her at Charles' house when she turned most peculiar again, you know. And she went on to recount to him all that she had heard, and added that she feared Charles might have been hurt. Father Quarcoopome looked up from the book slowly, and with eyes lifted to heaven whispered, "The Lord be with her." The old Morris Minor 1000 that had always symbolized moderation at the church, sped away along the high street. There were 3 occupants, the driver, the bishop and his wife. 5 minutes later, it could be seen driving in through the gates of bungalow number 22. Two solemn figures stood in the porchway, their arms entwined. One had his head in bandages, the other a sling on her left arm. The bishop and his wife got out of their car, greeted the sad couple, and together they went inside to sit down. They chatted briefly, then Mary left with her parents to return to their home. Helpless, Charles drove to Professor Eastman's house.